The stove sat at a 45-degree angle in the corner of Alvin Nordstrom's cabin, looking like someone had started installing it properly and then given up halfway through. Every trapper who visited his claim in the Wyoming territory in 1881 had the same reaction. They'd stare at the stove, frown, and ask why he'd installed it crooked. Some were more direct. "Did you run out of stovepipe? Were you drunk when you put that in? That's the stupidest stove installation I've ever seen." Alvin would smile and say it was exactly where he wanted it. The visitors would shake their heads and change the subject. "Crazy Swede," they'd mutter. "Doesn't even know how to install a stove properly." By February 1882, those same trappers weren't laughing anymore. They were showing up at Alvin's door, half frozen, begging to warm up. Their own cabins with properly installed stoves sitting square against the walls were barely keeping them alive. They burned wood constantly and still shivered. Frost coated their interior walls. They couldn't sleep properly because they had to tend the fire all night or wake up to near-freezing temperatures. Meanwhile, Alvin's cabin with its stupid crooked stove was maintaining temperatures 31 degrees warmer than theirs. Not 31 degrees warmer than outside, 31 degrees warmer than their heated cabins. His interior temperature averaged 62 degrees, while theirs struggled to reach 31. Same outside temperature, same type of stoves, same amount of firewood. Actually, Alvin burned less. The only significant difference was the angle of the stove. Alvin Nordstrom was 43 years old in 1881. He'd emigrated from Sweden in 1862 at age 24, worked in logging camps in Minnesota, tried farming in Wisconsin, and finally moved west to trap in the Wyoming mountains. He'd built his first cabin in 1878 and nearly froze to death that first winter. The cabin had a standard cast-iron stove positioned against the back wall, exactly as every trapping cabin and homestead cabin in the territory was built. The stove heated the wall behind it very effectively. Unfortunately, that wall was the exterior wall, and all that heat radiated uselessly to the outside. The interior of the cabin stayed cold. Alvin spent that winter burning enormous amounts of wood, working himself to exhaustion cutting and hauling, and still being miserably cold. He knew something was fundamentally wrong. The stove was working. It generated plenty of heat, but that heat wasn't staying in the cabin. It was escaping somehow. Over the summer of 1879, Alvin thought about the problem. He remembered buildings from his childhood in Sweden, particularly the farmhouse where he'd grown up. The fireplace there had been positioned in the center of the house, not against an exterior wall. The same fire heated multiple rooms because the heat radiated in all directions from the central mass. No heat was wasted warming the outside. Every bit of warmth went into the living space. That was the key insight. Heat radiates in all directions from a source. If you put the source against an exterior wall, half the heat radiates outward and is lost. If you put the source in the interior, all the heat stays inside. But Alvin couldn't put his cast-iron stove in the center of his cabin. The stove needed a chimney, and the chimney needed to exit through the roof. Running a chimney horizontally across the cabin to reach a central location wasn't practical with his resources. He needed a solution that worked with a vertical chimney, but didn't waste heat on an exterior wall. He studied his cabin layout, thinking about angles, walls, and heat radiation. Then he realized, if he couldn't move the stove to the center, he could angle it so that most of its radiating surfaces faced inward rather than outward. Instead of having one face against the exterior wall, he could position the stove at a 45-degree angle in the corner, with only the rear corner touching the wall. 3 sides of the stove would face into the room. Only a small corner section would face the exterior wall. This would redirect most of the radiant heat inward. In the fall of 1879, Alvin rebuilt his cabin stove installation with the new angled design. The other trappers who saw it thought he was incompetent. Stoves go flat against walls. Everyone knows that. That's how stoves are installed. Putting it at an angle was just wrong. It looked sloppy. It was a waste of space in an already small cabin. Alvin tried to explain his reasoning, but most people didn't listen. They'd decided he didn't know what he was doing, and that was that. One older trapper, a man named Bill Crawford who'd been in the mountains since the 1850s, listened more carefully. He didn't dismiss the idea immediately, but he was skeptical. "Might work, might not," Crawford said. "We'll see come winter." Winter, 1879 to 1880, proved Alvin's theory correct. His cabin was noticeably warmer than it had been the previous year, with the same stove burning the same amount of wood. He measured the difference using a thermometer he'd purchased specifically to test his theory. The previous winter, his cabin interior had averaged about 33 degrees when the exterior temperature was around 0. The new winter, with the angled stove, the interior averaged 58 degrees at the same exterior temperature. That was a 25-degree improvement from a simple change in stove position. The stove itself hadn't changed. The amount of wood burned hadn't changed. Only the angle had changed, and that angle made the difference between barely surviving and being genuinely comfortable. Bill Crawford came by midwinter to check on Alvin. When he felt how warm the cabin was, he stood silent for a long moment. Then he said, "That stove angle works. I was wrong to doubt you. Can you help me reposition my stove?" Alvin helped Crawford angle his stove over the next few days. Crawford's cabin temperature increased immediately. He reported the same roughly 25-degree improvement that Alvin had measured. 2 other trappers heard about the results and asked for help repositioning their stoves. By spring 1880, 4 cabins in the area had angled stoves, and 4 trappers were convinced the method worked. But the majority of trappers still hadn't tried it. They'd heard about it, but it seemed too simple, too strange, or they just didn't believe it could make that much difference. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was mild. Temperatures rarely dropped below 0. The conventional cabins were adequate for those conditions. Nobody froze. The difference between angled stoves and standard installations was noticeable but not critical. Some trappers pointed to this as evidence that the stove angle didn't really matter. Sure, Alvin's cabin was warmer, but so what? Their cabins were warm enough. Why go through the effort of reinstalling a stove for marginal improvement? This attitude changed completely when the winter of 1881 to 1882 arrived. That winter was brutal. Arctic air masses pushed far south. Temperatures in the Wyoming mountains dropped to -20 and stayed there for weeks. This was the kind of cold that tested everything. Inadequate cabins became deadly traps. Marginal improvements became the difference between survival and death. The trappers with standard stove installations suffered immediately. Their cabins couldn't maintain adequate heat despite burning wood constantly. They were trapped in a losing battle. The stoves generated heat, but so much of it radiated to the exterior walls and was lost that the interior never warmed properly. They burned more wood, trying to overcome the heat loss, but there's a limit to how much wood you can feed a stove safely. They were already at maximum burn rate and still cold. Several trappers developed frostbite from sleeping too close to their stoves, desperate for warmth. One man's cabin caught fire when he overloaded his stove trying to generate more heat. He escaped but lost everything. The conventional stove installations, adequate in mild winters, were failing catastrophically in extreme cold. Alvin Nordstrom's cabin, by contrast, was comfortable. He burned a moderate amount of wood, less than the other trappers were burning, and maintained an interior temperature of 60 to 65 degrees even when outside temperatures hit -20. The angled stove radiated its heat inward, warming all the interior surfaces. Those surfaces, the floor, the other walls, the ceiling, absorbed heat and re-radiated it back into the space. The cabin became a warm box. Very little heat was lost to the exterior. The temperature difference between Alvin's cabin and the conventional cabins reached its peak on February 3, 1882. Outside temperature, -18 degrees. Average conventional cabin interior temperature, 31 degrees. Alvin's cabin interior temperature, 62 degrees. The difference was 31 degrees. Same outside conditions, same type of structure, same type of stove, completely different interior temperatures based solely on stove angle. Word spread fast. Freezing trappers showed up at Alvin's door asking how his cabin stayed so warm. He explained the stove angle principle again, this time to desperate men who were finally ready to listen. Over the next 2 weeks, Alvin helped 11 trappers reposition their stoves. The work was challenging in the middle of winter. The stove had to be disconnected, moved, and the chimney adjusted to the new angle. The floor beneath had to be protected with additional fire-resistant material since the angled position changed the heat distribution pattern, but the results were immediate and dramatic. Every cabin that angled its stove saw interior temperatures jump by 25 to 30 degrees within hours. Men who'd been on the edge of abandoning their claims and fleeing to settlements decided to stay. The stove angle quite literally saved the trapping season for nearly a dozen men. If you're fascinated by simple changes that produced dramatic results, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're uncovering forgotten knowledge where small adjustments in technique created huge improvements in performance. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next episode. The physics behind the improvement were straightforward, though Alvin didn't know the formal terms. Heat radiates from a hot surface in all directions unless blocked. A cast iron stove is essentially a box with 6 sides, each radiating heat. In a standard installation with one side flat against an exterior wall, that side's radiation hits the wall, heats it, and that heat conducts through the wall to the outside where it's lost. The wall becomes a heat sink, continuously draining warmth from the stove. In Alvin's angled installation, only a small corner of the stove touched the exterior wall. Most of the stove's surfaces faced into the interior. Their radiation hit interior surfaces or warmed the air in the living space directly. Almost no heat was lost to the exterior, but there was more to it than just redirecting radiation. The angled stove created better convection patterns in the cabin. Convection is the circulation of air driven by temperature differences. Hot air rises, cold air sinks, creating natural circulation. With a standard stove against a wall, the hot air rises straight up along that wall, hits the ceiling, spreads outward, cools, and sinks in the far corners of the cabin. This creates a strong temperature gradient, very hot near the stove and ceiling, very cold in the far corners and at floor level. With an angled stove projecting into the room, the hot air rises more centrally, creating more even circulation. The temperature gradient from hot to cold zones was much smaller. The entire cabin heated more evenly. The angled position also meant the stove was more accessible from more angles. Alvin could approach it from 3 sides instead of just 1 or 2. This made tending the fire easier and safer. He could add wood, adjust drafts, and remove ashes without crowding into a corner. This practical advantage wasn't the main reason for the design, but it was a significant benefit. The other trappers noticed this. Managing the fire was less awkward. You weren't trapped in a tight space between the hot stove and the wall. The workspace around the stove was larger and more functional. This seemed like a minor detail, but it mattered during long winters when you were tending the fire multiple times per day for months. There was also a psychological effect. The angled stove looked more like a hearth, a central gathering point, than an appliance shoved against a wall. It created a focal point in the cabin. You naturally oriented toward it. This made the space feel more intentional, more designed, less like a crude box with a heat source. Several trappers commented that their cabins felt more like homes after repositioning their stoves. This was partly the warmth, but also the changed spatial relationship. The stove became the center of the dwelling, rather than an afterthought pushed to the perimeter. This subtle shift affected how people experienced their living space. A cabin that felt like a home was easier to endure through long, isolated winters. The additional floor protection required for the angled stove was important. With more of the stove's radiant heat directed downward into the room rather than into the wall, the floor beneath got hotter. This required better fire protection. Alvin used a thick layer of sand covered with flat stones to create a fireproof base extending well beyond the stove's footprint. This base absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night, providing additional thermal mass. It also prevented any possibility of the floor catching fire from radiant heat or fallen embers. Several trappers who'd repositioned their stoves without adequate floor protection scorched their floorboards. One nearly started a fire. Proper installation required attention to this detail. The chimney adjustment was another critical element. Standard installations had chimneys going straight up from the stove through the roof. Angling the stove meant the chimney connection had to be offset. This required elbow joints in the stovepipe. The trappers learned that the elbows had to be properly fitted and sealed, otherwise smoke leaked into the cabin. They also learned that too many elbows or too much horizontal run reduced the draft, making the stove burn poorly. The optimal configuration was one 45-degree elbow close to the stove, then a straight vertical run through the roof. This maintained good draft while accommodating the angle. Getting this right required some trial and error. The first few installations had problems until the technique was refined. Another consideration was spark and creosote management. The angled stovepipe configuration could create areas where creosote, the tarry residue from wood smoke, accumulated more readily. This creosote was flammable and could cause chimney fires if not removed regularly. The trappers learned to clean their chimneys more frequently with the new configuration. This extra maintenance was a small price for the huge temperature improvement, but it had to be done. One trapper who neglected chimney cleaning had a chimney fire that could have burned down his cabin. After that incident, everyone took cleaning seriously. The angled installation worked beautifully, but it required proper maintenance. The type of wood burned also mattered more with the angled installation. The stove's improved efficiency meant it extracted more heat from each piece of wood. But it also meant that wet or green wood, which burns inefficiently, caused more problems. The moisture created more smoke and more creosote. Alvin emphasized the importance of burning only dry, well-seasoned wood. He'd cut his firewood in late spring and stack it to dry through the summer and early fall. By the time winter arrived, the wood had less than 20% moisture content. It burned hot and clean. Some trappers cut their wood in the fall and burned it immediately. This green wood had 40 to 50% moisture content. It burned poorly in any stove, but especially poorly in the more efficient angled installation. Those trappers saw less improvement until they started using properly dried wood. The cabin design influenced how much benefit the angled stove provided. Alvin's cabin was relatively small, about 12 feet by 16 feet. In this compact space, the angled stove could effectively heat the entire area. Larger cabins saw less dramatic improvement because the stove couldn't heat as much volume regardless of its angle. One trapper with a 20 by 20 cabin repositioned his stove and saw only about a 15-degree improvement instead of the 25 to 30 degrees others experienced. The angled position helped, but couldn't overcome the basic limitation that one small stove couldn't adequately heat a large space. For optimal results, cabin size had to match stove capacity. Cabin insulation also mattered. The angled stove reduced heat loss through radiation to exterior walls, but it couldn't prevent heat loss through conduction through those walls or through air infiltration. Cabins with good chinking, sealed gaps, and some insulation benefited more from the angled stove than poorly sealed cabins where heat leaked out continuously. Alvin's cabin had been carefully constructed with tight-fitting logs and thorough chinking. The angled stove worked synergistically with the good basic construction. A few trappers repositioned their stoves but didn't address their cabin's poor ceiling. They saw improvement, but not as much as they expected. The stove angle was a big factor, but it wasn't the only factor. Total thermal performance depended on the entire system. The positioning in the corner at 45 degrees turned out to be optimal for most cabin layouts. Some trappers experimented with other angles. 30 degrees, 60 degrees, or positioning the stove in different locations entirely. The 45-degree corner placement consistently performed best. It maximized interior radiation while minimizing exterior heat loss. It created good convection patterns. It left most of the cabin's floor space usable. Other configurations had trade-offs that made them less effective. The 45-degree angle represented a sweet spot that balanced all the factors. Alvin had arrived at this through intuition and reasoning. Testing by others confirmed it was indeed optimal, at least for typical rectangular cabin layouts. By the spring of 1882, angled stove installations had spread throughout the Wyoming trapping district. Over 30 cabins had been modified. Every single one reported significant temperature increases, typically 25 to 35 degrees depending on cabin specifics. Wood consumption dropped by similar percentages. Men who'd been on the verge of giving up trapping because the winters were too brutal now had comfortable cabins they could endure. The trapping season that would have seen massive abandonment and economic losses instead continued successfully. All because of a simple change in stove angle that most people had initially dismissed as stupid. The economic impact was substantial. Each trapper saved roughly 3 to 5 cords of firewood per winter. At an hour of labor per cord for cutting and hauling, that was 3 to 5 fewer days of dangerous, exhausting work. Over a winter, those saved days accumulated to over a week of labor that could be spent on productive trapping instead of just surviving. The increased comfort meant better sleep, better health, and better decision-making. Men weren't exhausted from fighting the cold and tending fires all night. They could focus on their work. Trap yields increased slightly across the district, probably because trappers had more energy for checking lines and maintaining equipment. The stove angle innovation created ripple effects throughout the local economy. The knowledge spread beyond Wyoming. Trappers who moved to other regions took the technique with them. At rendezvous gatherings and trading posts, they told others about the angled stove method. By the mid-1880s, the technique was known throughout the Rocky Mountain trapping communities. But interestingly, it never became universal. Many people stuck with standard installations even after hearing about the benefits. Why? Partly conservatism and tradition. "This is how stoves are installed," was a powerful argument even against clear evidence of a better way. Partly because the benefit wasn't obvious until you experienced extreme cold. In mild winters, the difference wasn't life or death, just comfort. People who hadn't suffered through brutal cold didn't feel urgency to change. There was also resistance from people who'd already invested effort in standard installations. Acknowledging that a simple angle change would have saved them massive suffering was psychologically difficult. It meant admitting they'd suffered unnecessarily. Some people couldn't accept this. They rationalized that their standard installation was fine, that the angled stove was only marginally better, that it wasn't worth the effort to change. This defensive reaction to information that contradicts past decisions is common human behavior. The people most resistant to the angled stove method were often those who'd suffered most under standard installations. They'd invested so much effort in making the old way work that admitting there was a much better way undermined their identity and choices. The technique eventually reached homesteaders and settlers, not just trappers. Farm families building cabins in cold regions started using angled stove installations. The same benefits applied. Warmer homes with less wood consumption. The practice became somewhat common in frontier areas through the late 1800s, though it was never universal and was rarely documented in building guides or official sources. It remained folk knowledge, passed person to person, rather than formal engineering knowledge. This meant it was vulnerable to being lost as building practices changed, and industrialization brought standardized heating systems. By the early 1900s, cast iron stoves were being replaced by more sophisticated heating systems, coal furnaces with ductwork, later, oil and gas heating. The specific technique of angling a wood stove became less relevant as wood heating itself declined. The knowledge survived in isolated rural areas where wood heat remained common, but it faded from broader awareness. By mid-century, most people had never heard of deliberately angling a stove for thermal performance. If someone saw an angled stove, they'd assume it was installed incorrectly, just as the Wyoming trappers had initially assumed about Alvin's stove. The revival of wood heat in the 1970s energy crisis led to rediscovery of many traditional heating techniques, including optimal stove placement. Modern analysis confirmed what Alvin had figured out intuitively. Stove position dramatically affects heat distribution and efficiency. Contemporary heating engineers recommend central placement when possible, or if not possible, positioning that maximizes interior radiation and minimizes exterior heat loss. The specific 45-degree corner angle that Alvin used is now recognized as an excellent compromise for rectangular buildings with chimneys at the corners. Modern building science has validated his 1879 innovation. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. We're bringing back practical innovations that were mocked as stupid but proved brilliant when tested. Your support keeps us researching these forgotten techniques. Hit that subscribe button now. Today, most people with wood stoves don't think carefully about positioning. They put the stove where it seems convenient or where previous owners put it. Many homes have stoves against exterior walls, wasting heat the same way the Wyoming trappers' cabins did in the 1880s. The knowledge that Alvin developed and demonstrated exists in heating engineering literature, but it's not widely known among actual stove users. A homeowner could easily gain 20 or 30 degrees of interior temperature just by repositioning their stove using the same fuel. But almost no one knows to try this. The knowledge has been lost again, retained by specialists but not part of common practice. The story of Alvin Nordstrom's stupid stove angle reveals several important patterns. First, simple changes can produce dramatic results. The difference between standard and angled positioning was tiny in terms of effort, but huge in terms of outcome. Looking for high-leverage changes, small adjustments with big impacts is often more valuable than complex solutions. Second, unconventional approaches trigger skepticism regardless of their merit. Alvin's angled stove violated expectations about how stoves should look. People dismissed it immediately based on appearance, not performance. Overcoming this aesthetic bias requires demonstrable results that can't be denied. Third, extreme conditions reveal what actually works. In mild winters, the standard stove installations were adequate. Only when brutal cold arrived did their inadequacy become undeniable. The extreme test separated what worked from what seemed like it should work. Fourth, knowledge transmission requires both demonstration and explanation. Alvin showing his warm cabin convinced people to try the angled stove. But understanding why it worked helped the technique spread and be adapted to different situations. Fifth, even proven improvements face adoption barriers. Conservatism, sunk costs, cognitive dissonance, and social conformity all work against change even when change is clearly beneficial. Sixth, folk knowledge can solve problems that formal expertise misses. Alvin wasn't an engineer or heating expert. He was a trapper, applying common sense observation about heat radiation. His practical solution outperformed anything in official building guides. Respecting and preserving folk knowledge matters because it often contains insights that formal systems overlook. Seventh, losing and rediscovering knowledge is wasteful. The stove angle principle was figured out in the 1870s, forgotten by the mid-1900s, and rediscovered in the 1970s. All the people who suffered in cold homes during that century of forgetting could have benefited from knowledge that already existed. The 31-degree temperature difference between Alvin's cabin and his neighbors' cabins was real, measured, and reproducible. It wasn't subjective opinion or lucky circumstance. It was objective thermal performance difference driven by applied physics. The angled stove radiated more heat inward and less heat outward. The improved heat distribution created more even temperatures and better comfort. These effects were inevitable given the design change. Every cabin that angled its stove experienced similar improvements. The results were consistent and predictable. This makes the initial dismissal of the technique particularly frustrating. People rejected a proven improvement because it looked wrong, not because it performed poorly. This pattern of rejecting performance-based evidence in favor of appearance-based judgment appears throughout history. We've seen it repeatedly in these stories. The mud roof hut that held more heat, the dirt wall shelter that survived the Arctic front, the primitive water filter that outlasted modern systems, the crooked cabin that withstood the cold snap, and now the stupid stove angle that made cabins dramatically warmer. In every case, people judged based on how things looked rather than how they worked. In every case, extreme conditions revealed the truth. In every case, the mocked innovation proved superior. And in every case, many people still resisted adopting the better method even after seeing proof. Why do humans struggle so much with this? Why do we prioritize appearance and convention over performance and results? Partly, it's efficient mental shortcuts. We can't deeply analyze everything. We use templates and heuristics. Does it look right? Does it match the pattern? If yes, probably okay. If no, probably wrong. This works well enough most of the time to be useful, but it fails catastrophically when evaluating genuine innovations that don't match existing patterns. Partly it's social conformity. We want to fit in, to do what others do, to not be seen as strange or stupid. Adopting an unusual technique, even if it works better, marks you as different. Many people would rather suffer with everyone else than thrive alone. Partly, it's ego protection. Admitting that a simple change would have prevented your suffering means admitting you suffered unnecessarily. That's painful. It's easier to deny or downplay the improvement. Partly, it's institutional inertia. Once a practice becomes standard, it develops supporting infrastructure, training, and expertise. Changing the standard threatens people whose knowledge and status depend on the old way. They resist not because the old way is better, but because change threatens them. All these factors work together to preserve inadequate practices and resist superior alternatives. Overcoming these barriers requires not just having a better solution, but also understanding and addressing the psychological and social factors that prevent adoption. Alvin Nordstrom's contribution wasn't inventing a new heating technology. Cast iron stoves existed, chimneys existed, the physics of heat radiation existed. His contribution was recognizing that standard practice was suboptimal and figuring out a simple modification that dramatically improved performance. This kind of optimization innovation, improving what already exists rather than creating something entirely new, is often undervalued. But it's enormously important. Most of our daily technologies and practices could probably be significantly improved with simple modifications if someone bothered to question assumptions and test alternatives. We accept suboptimal performance because it's standard, never asking whether standard is actually good. The stupid stove angle wasn't stupid. It was brilliant. It was stupid only in the eyes of people who judged without understanding, who valued appearance over function, who dismissed what didn't match their expectations. The 31-degree temperature difference proved who was actually stupid. Not the man who tried something different, but the people who clung to inferior methods despite clear evidence of a better way. Alvin Nordstrom's legacy isn't just warmer cabins for a few dozen trappers. It's a demonstration that simple changes matter, that questioning standard practice can reveal significant improvements, and that the courage to look stupid might be the smartest thing you can do.